I got the call while on a 3-day inspection assignment in Montana. My neighbor, an old hunting buddy named Rick, left me a voicemail I'll never forget. "Jace, buddy, you better get back here. The HOA's got a demolition crew on your property. I think they're gonna tear your cabin down." My heart stopped. I yanked the rental truck into a U-turn on a mountain pass and headed straight to the airport. I didn't even finish my coffee. I'm Jace O'Connor. I work for federal property claims. When hurricanes, wildfires, or mudslides hit, I'm the guy who shows up to inspect damages, estimate payouts, and sniff out fraud. I know every trick in the book. What the HOA didn't know was that messing with my cabin was about to become the worst mistake they'd ever made. When I finally pulled into my wooded neighborhood in North Carolina the next morning, the first thing I saw was a backhoe parked halfway down my private drive. A construction dumpster sat right next to it, full of wood. My wood. And there she stood, Andrea Bellevue. HOA president, self-appointed property queen, and the most insufferable middle-aged tyrant east of the Mississippi. She practically lived in beige cardigans and wielded her clipboard like it was a holy relic. She turned as I stepped out of my truck, her expression already twisting. "You're trespassing," I said, my voice flat as I pointed to the backhoe. "That's my property." Andrea didn't flinch. "Mr. O'Connor, your so-called cabin violates Article 12 of our architectural standards. It's an eyesore and the board voted unanimously to remove it." I laughed once. "You didn't notify me. You didn't even file for a demolition permit. We attempted to notify you. You've been unreachable," she snapped, flipping through her clipboard like it proved something. "And this isn't up for debate. The structure was non-compliant and I cut her off." "Andrea, that cabin's been here since 1997. It was grandfathered in when the HOA was formed, and you know it." She blinked, then straightened her posture like I'd just insulted her genealogy. "That's irrelevant. The board has new standards." "We decided, you're not the law," I said, stepping closer. "And you just authorized a private contractor to enter federal tax-mapped land without consent or permit. That's a felony." The color drained from her face just for a second. "Don't threaten me, Mr. O'Connor." "I'm not threatening you," I said, pulling open the tailgate of my truck. I grabbed a manila envelope I'd been keeping for years, my original deed, survey maps, boundary lines, and the grandfather clause the HOA had signed off on when the association was formed. I held it out. "This proves you've just committed trespass, destruction of private property, and possibly fraud depending on how you falsified the vote." Andrea didn't take the folder. She just stared at me like I'd pulled a gun. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," she hissed before stomping back to her ridiculous white Lexus. I looked at the backhoe again. The lid of my woodshed was crushed and several piles of firewood were gone. That alone was enough damage to trigger liability claims. But I wasn't just going to file a report, I was going to bury the HOA in it. And I had the full force of federal property law on my side. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through a stack of property records I kept in a fireproof box under the floorboards. Moonlight filtered through the cracked blinds, catching the edge of a laminated topographic map I'd used to mark every inch of my land. The damage they'd done was significant, but it was the arrogance that lit the fire in my gut. They thought I was just another weekend resident. A harmless guy with a chainsaw and a subscription to Field and Stream. They had no idea I spent the last 15 years testifying in courtrooms and auditing disaster claims that made insurance companies sweat blood. They just bulldozed their way into a federal-sized trap. At dawn, I drove to the county records office and requested a certified parcel overlay. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I asked for the last 20 years of HOA filings, but he printed them without a word. I spread everything out across the hood of my truck in the parking lot. Something didn't sit right. The HOA's original boundary map from 2005 was missing several key revisions that should have been filed every 3 years under North Carolina statute. They'd never updated the association's expansion filings. which meant they had no legal authority over my tract whatsoever. I called the county zoning enforcement division. Then I called the state property ombudsman. Then I called somebody I hadn't spoken to in 11 years, Detective Carla Mendel. Carla had been my partner on a cross-agency task force back when I worked insurance fraud cases in the Carolinas. She left the force to work private legal investigations, the kind of work that required fewer warrants and more creativity. I met her that afternoon at a coffee shop in Asheville. She wore a leather jacket and aviators, same as ever. "You look like you found something radioactive," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "This HOA tried to demolish my cabin," I said, laying down the maps and filings. "And they built their entire authority on forged expansion lines." Carla whistled low. "You got proof of that?" I pointed to the gaps in the record. "Their boundaries were never ratified by the county. They skipped the zoning hearings probably because they knew it wouldn't pass. They've been issuing fines and enforcing demolitions under a jurisdiction that doesn't legally exist." She traced her finger across the map. "That's more than civil. That's criminal if they knowingly enforced voided authority." "Exactly. And I've got records of them collecting dues from properties they have no legal claim over." She leaned back. "You want to file a civil suit? I want to shut them down, permanently." That night, I installed 2 new motion-activated trail cameras near the tree line. I didn't trust Andrea or her board to leave things alone. Sure enough, just after midnight, headlights appeared at the bottom of the drive. I watched from the shadows as a silver SUV crept up to the edge of the property. A man got out, looked around, and snapped photos of the foundation. Then he sprayed something on the side of the woodshed, orange paint, a giant X. I stepped out with my flashlight and lit him up. He froze. "I'm just a contractor. Got a text from someone on the board, Andrea something. Said to tag the structure for removal." "Did you get a permit number?" He shook his head. "No, just an address and a Venmo deposit." I took a photo of his license plate. "You're trespassing, you'll be subpoenaed." He didn't argue, just got in his car and left. The next morning, I filed a formal criminal complaint with the county sheriff. I attached photos of the illegal demolition, the forged HOA boundary filings, and the overnight vandalism. I included a notarized statement from the contractor, who'd already responded to Carla's outreach with a panicked apology, and a text history naming Andrea. At noon, 2 deputies and a zoning officer accompanied me to the HOA office, an over-renovated ranch house with a fake Greek column facade. Andrea sat behind a glass desk, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they hadn't read a real legal document in their lives. The zoning officer spoke first. "We've received evidence your association has been operating beyond its authorized jurisdiction. We're issuing a cease and desist on all enforcement activities pending investigation." Andrea's eyes darted between us. "This is a mistake. We've been operating under the same charter for years." "That charter was never ratified for the expanded boundary," I said. "You've been collecting dues and issuing penalties on properties outside your legal reach. That's fraud." One of the board members stood up. "We were told those filings went through. Our former secretary handled that." Carla stepped forward, flipping open a folder. "Your secretary resigned 5 years ago. No filings were submitted after that. You've been forging authority." Andrea's hands shook as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "This is outrageous. We're a volunteer board. We made decisions in good faith." The deputy cleared his throat. "You authorized a demolition on private property without notification, permit, or jurisdiction. That's not good faith. That's criminal trespass and property damage. And we have testimony from the contractor you hired last night," I added. "He tagged my shed for removal based on your instructions and a cash payment. That's conspiracy to commit vandalism." Andrea's facade finally cracked. "He misunderstood. He wasn't supposed to." Carla held up a printed screenshot of the Venmo transaction. "It says mark structure behind cabin X for demo. That's your note." For the first time, Andrea had no reply. the zoning officer set a red notice on the desk. Effective immediately, the HOA's board is suspended from operating in any capacity pending further investigation. Any attempt to enforce rules, collect dues, or contact residents on behalf of the association will be considered unlawful. As we walked out, one of the deputies leaned toward me. "You ever thought about running for the board yourself? Folks around here could use someone who actually knows what the law says." I didn't answer right away. I just looked out over the ridge where the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. When I got home, the first thing I did was call Rick. "They're finished," I said. "The whole board?" "Damn right they are," he said. "You're gonna love this. We're organizing a neighborhood meeting next week. Folks finally want to talk about dissolving the HOA altogether." I looked at the orange X still faintly visible on the woodshed. Then I walked to the garage and pulled out my pressure washer. It was time to clean house. Literally and legally. The community meeting was set for Saturday, held in the old firehouse down the road. Rick and a few others had already spread the word, and by the time I arrived, the parking lot was packed with pickups, Subarus, and lawn chairs strapped to roof racks. People leaned against tailgates and sipped coffee from thermoses, murmuring in low tones. You could feel it in the air, months, maybe years, of quiet frustration finally boiling up. Inside, folding chairs filled the room. I counted at least 60 residents, more than I'd ever seen attend anything HOA related. A few families stood near the back with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the front table where a temporary moderator, a retired judge named Evelyn Hartwick, sat with a legal pad. She had agreed to oversee the meeting at Carla's suggestion, an impartial figure with enough legal clout to keep things civil. Andrea and what was left of the board didn't show. Their seats sat empty, nameplates removed. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Let's begin. First order of business, discussion of unlawful board actions, including property violations and unratified expansions." I stood when she called my name. I didn't plan to say much. I let the paperwork do the lifting. I passed copies of the parcel overlays, the unfiled maps, the correspondence logs, and the zoning office's cease and desist through the rows. No summaries, no speeches, just facts. A man near the front, a landscaper named Miguel who owned a plot near the creek, flipped through the documents. "So they've been fining me for fence height on land they've got no right to manage." "That's right," I said. "Same with the mandatory landscaping rules and architectural guidelines. None of it's enforceable." A woman in a denim vest, Charla, owner of the general store, stood next. "I paid over $1,200 in fines last year for a metal roof they didn't like. They threatened to put a lien on my house." "They threatened me too," said a younger guy, Kyle, who ran a small engine repair shop out of his garage. "I asked to see the bylaws that let them do that. They told me it was internal policy." Evelyn held up a hand. "We'll document individual claims in writing. For now, let's focus on whether the current HOA has legal standing to continue." The vote took 10 minutes. Paper ballots were collected and tallied by 2 off-duty sheriff's clerks Evelyn had brought in. The result was unanimous 63-0 in favor of dissolving the board and initiating a formal audit of all HOA activities and financial transactions for the past 10 years. Evelyn stood. By majority vote and under the emergency provisions outlined in the original community charter, the HOA board is hereby dissolved, pending legal confirmation. Applause filled the firehouse. Some people hugged, others shook hands. I stepped outside for air and found Carla leaning against the side of the building, her expression unreadable. "They're going to try something," she said, not looking at me. "They don't have the numbers anymore." "They don't need numbers," she said. "They need leverage. Power addicts don't just walk away, not people like Andrea." She was right. And the next morning, we found out just how far Andrea was willing to go. It started with a call from the county clerk's office. A junior staffer flagged something odd while processing the HOA's dissolution filing. Someone had accessed the HOA's corporate account and wired almost $20,000 to a private escrow firm in Florida. The timing. Less than 24 hours after the board had been stripped of authority, Carla and I drove straight to the escrow firm's local affiliate. They confirmed the transfer and provided a copy of the wire receipt. Andrea Bellevue's name was right there, along with a forged title claiming the funds were part of a community development trust. We didn't waste time. Carla contacted the district attorney's office. I looped in the state financial crimes unit. Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Andrea's arrest on charges of wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, and falsification of legal documents. The arrest happened at her real estate office in downtown Asheville. She was led out in handcuffs, her face tight with rage, flanked by stunned colleagues who had no idea what was happening. The story hit the local news within hours, but it didn't stop there. While reviewing the financial records, investigators discovered something worse. Andrea had been siphoning funds from HOA dues into a shell company registered under her cousin's name. The company had issued invoices for landscape maintenance and security enhancement services that, according to every resident we interviewed, had never occurred. The total: nearly $90,000 over 6 years. By the end of the week, 2 more board members were implicated, one for signing off on fraudulent invoices, the other for threatening residents with false liens in exchange for cash settlements. Both were arrested. The community was stunned. People who'd kept their heads down for years now spoke openly. About intimidation tactics, about petty fines for things like wind chimes or unapproved porch lights, about anonymous complaints that always seemed to come after someone questioned the board. One resident, a retired Army major named Linwood, described how Andrea had ordered a fence removed while he was overseas visiting family. She claimed it was non-compliant, but never provided documentation. The fence had cost him nearly $4 grand. We gathered testimonies, affidavits, and compiled a formal civil suit. Carla helped draft a class action complaint seeking restitution for every unlawful fine, forced removal, and coerced payment. The final total was staggering over $200,000 in damages across 31 households. The case went before a district judge in late spring. Andrea's attorney tried to argue that the board had acted within the spirit of community standards, but the judge wasn't having it. You operated outside the bounds of your authority, collected funds under false pretenses, and used fear and misinformation to control residents, he said. This isn't a question of negligence. It's a question of intent. The court ordered full restitution, froze Andrea's personal assets, and placed a lien on her real estate holdings to cover the difference. The HOA's corporate account was liquidated into a community fund to repair damages and reimburse residents. The best part: the judge granted an injunction banning Andrea and her co-defendants from serving on any HOA board in the state of North Carolina for the rest of their lives. After the ruling, we held a cookout at the edge of the ridge. Someone brought a smoker, someone else set up a projector and played old westerns against the side of a barn. Kids ran through the grass with sparklers, and for the first time in years, nobody was watching their backs. Rick handed me a cold beer and nodded toward the fire pit. You planning to stick around more often? I looked out at the tree line. The cabin needed some repairs: new siding, a fresh coat of paint, but it was still standing, still mine. Yeah, I said, I think I will. He clapped me on the shoulder. Good. We need more people who know how to fight fire with paperwork. I laughed and raised the bottle. To knowing the system better than the people who try to abuse it. The cheers around the fire said it all. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came one file folder at a time. But when it landed hard, and it left a mark that power-hungry cowards like Andrea Bellevue would never forget. It had been 3 months since the court ruling dismantled the HOA and exposed the financial rot that had festered under Andrea Bellevue's reign. The neighborhood had shifted visibly. People waved again on morning walks. Yard signs offering free firewood or fresh eggs popped up without fear of unauthorized sales. Gardens once hidden behind hedges were blooming out in the open. But under all the fresh paint and new enthusiasm, something still simmered. One afternoon, I got a call from Evelyn Hartwick. She didn't waste time. "There's a problem," she said. "A serious one. You need to come down to the county registrar's office." "Bring Carla." Carla arrived 10 minutes after I did, her hair pulled back and a yellow legal pad under one arm. Evelyn met us in the side office, her expression tight. "A clerk flagged a filing this morning," she said, laying out a document. "Someone just submitted a quitclaim deed transferring ownership of 3 properties, including yours, to a holding company registered in Delaware." Carla's pen tapped the corner of the page. "Let me guess. The company's called something like North Ridge Preservation Partners LLC?" Evelyn nodded once. "Filed by a notary who's already under investigation for forgery in Buncombe County. The signature on your parcel, Jace, doesn't match any version on file." "It's a fake." I leaned over the form, my jaw tight. "That's a felony. Wire fraud, identity theft, real estate fraud at a minimum." "It gets worse," Evelyn said, pulling out a second folder. "North Ridge Preservation Partners filed an application for a zoning variance yesterday. If approved, it would allow for commercial development on a section of land that includes your property." Carla's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to flip it. Fast. Probably got a buyer lined up already. If the zoning goes through, they'll sell it out from under the rightful owners before the fraud's even caught." "Andrea's behind it," I said flatly. "Or someone she's connected with. She's out on bail, but she's not done." Evelyn sat back. "We've already contacted the district attorney. They're pulling all related documents and freezing the variance request. But this is deeper than we thought." Carla was already dialing. "I know someone in the state attorney's real estate crimes unit. He'll want in on this." By nightfall, the DA's office had issued a court order halting all transactions involving North Ridge Preservation Partners. A state-level task force was assigned to track the LLC's filings, and within 48 hours, they uncovered something even more damning. The company had acquired deeds for 6 other properties, some signed by people who had been dead for years. It was a paper heist. Coordinated and fast. And it had Andrea's fingerprints all over it. Carla and I met with Assistant District Attorney Marcus Rell in a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. He was sharp, methodical, and had a tendency to talk while pacing. "We've traced the LLC to a P.O. box in Wilmington," he said. "But the bank account attached to it was opened in South Carolina under a fake EIN. The IP address used to submit the zoning request traces back to a laptop seized from Andrea's office during the first investigation." "She's violating her bail terms," Carla said. "That alone should put her back in custody." Marcus nodded. "Already filed the motion, but we're going further. We're charging her under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. If we can prove this was part of a long-term pattern of coordinated fraud, it's not just real estate fraud anymore. It's organized crime." That word hung in the air, organized. It explained the speed, the precision, the way the LLC had filed everything just within legal windows. Andrea hadn't just been corrupt, she'd been building a network. The arrests came 2 days later. Not just Andrea this time, but her cousin, the notary, and 2 men who'd posed as zoning consultants. One had a history of convictions for mortgage fraud in Florida. The other had been quietly disbarred in Georgia after botching a land deal involving protected wetlands. Andrea went down yelling. Literally. As deputies led her out of her temporary rental home, she shouted about political conspiracies and retaliation from jealous neighbors. It was pathetic. And it was over. The court froze all assets tied to the LLC and voided every fraudulent deed. The judge ordered a full audit of any property transactions connected to the former HOA board for the past decade. The fraud unit found even more shady transfers, some so old the original owners had moved out years ago without realizing their land had been used in collateral scams. Carla and I worked with the state to return ownership to the rightful parties. It took weeks of paperwork, interviews, and notarized affidavits. But piece by piece, we rebuilt the map, our map. The final restitution hearing took place in August. Evelyn stood before a packed courtroom as the appointed trustee read the final findings. The North Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, under the authority of Andrea Bellevue and co-conspirators, engaged in a sustained pattern of fraudulent activity, including unlawful property seizures, unauthorized financial transfers, and identity forgeries. The court hereby orders full restitution to all affected parties, the permanent dissolution of the HOA's corporate charter, and bans the named individuals from operating or advising any housing association, development board, or real estate trust within the state of North Carolina for life. Andrea didn't look up once. She sat stiff, hands folded, eyes locked on the floor. Her cousin wept openly. The two fake consultants didn't even appear. They'd already taken plea deals in exchange for testimony. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I stayed back. Let the neighbors speak. People who had been burned, bullied, and buried under illegitimate fines now stood proud, detailing how they'd rebuilt a community without fear. Later that week, we held the first meeting of the new community council, not an HOA, not a board, just a collective of property owners who'd agreed to voluntary, transparent cooperation. Evelyn chaired the meeting, but nobody sat behind a podium. Decisions were made by consensus. We voted to allocate a portion of the restitution fund toward a shared emergency maintenance reserve, and another portion to help elderly residents cover past fines they'd paid under duress. Rick leaned over to me during the meeting. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day this place ran on trust instead of rules. Turns out trust is cheaper," I said, glancing around the room, "and a hell of a lot harder to fake." After the meeting, I walked back to my cabin alone. The sun dipped low behind the tree line, casting gold across the roof. A few boards still needed sanding, and the woodshed still bore a faint outline where the orange X had once been. I didn't wash it off completely. I left it there, faded and harmless, a reminder. Not of what they tried to do, but of what they failed to do. The cabin stood, and so did I.